evening's program on offshore wind. I'm Mona Phillips. As Laura mentioned, we are both I'm the other co-chair of the Climate Reality Massachusetts Southcoast chapter. Just as a little information, Climate Reality is an international organization that was formed in 2006 by President Gore. And the purpose of it is to educate about the cause and effect of climate change and to advocate for viable solutions. It's almost a year ago that our chapter hosted our first offshore wind presentation. And looking back, you see how much has changed. As a new industry in the US, offshore wind has had its challenges, but after a slow start, it's beginning to gain traction here on this East Coast. For example, the South Fork Wind Farm, America's first utility-scale project, is now officially completed and is supplying wind power to 70,000 homes in New York. The Avangrid 806 megawatt Vineyard Wind project off the coast of Massachusetts was launched in 2023, which when completed in early 25 will power 400,000 homes. Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island have jointly solicited proposals for almost 7 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity, to which several companies, Avangrid included, have responded. Awards will be announced by the end of the summer. For those of you who might have seen it, in the March 27th article in the New Bedford Light, Anastasia Lennon wrote a wonderful article on this very subject. I heartily recommend that to you. There has been more coordination. Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont have joined Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island to develop a regional transmission infrastructure serving multiple projects in place of the current costlier practice of building lines for individual wind farms. So it's not too much of a stretch to imagine that a huge number of households will be powered by wind in the not too distant future. Tonight, I'm pleased to introduce Christopher Hardy, Program Manager of Offshore Wind Outreach for Avangrid. Chris came to Avangrid with 25 years experience in public affairs, government relations, and community outreach, including 15 years in the renewable energy industry. He has worked to gain social acceptance and license for complex, large-scale wind, solar, geothermal, hydroelectric, and battery storage products. These projects were spread across North America in 25 different states and 2 provinces. So Chris is well-versed in renewable energy challenges. Prior to his renewable energy focus, he was the Director of Legislative Affairs for the Massachusetts Audubon Society, the oldest and largest nonprofit in Massachusetts. He earned his bachelor's degree in commerce, organizations, and entrepreneurship from Brown University. And Chris is at home in New England as a resident of Marblehead, Massachusetts. While we at Climate Reality advocate for renewables, we see the industry only from the outside. Tonight, we can get an insider's perspective on the wind industry, public perception, and the potential and growing pains of the offshore wind industry. So before we get started, I just want to let you know there will be ample time for questions at the end of Chris's presentation. Please put your questions in the chat or raise your hand icon, and we will do our best to get all your questions answered. In the meantime, if you'd put your speakers on mute, and without further ado, I want to welcome Chris.
Good evening, and thank you, Mona. It's great to speak with you tonight as part of the Climate Reality Project. I wanted to start by putting my background in context because I think it reflects some of the intergenerational nature of this work. Al Gore presented an inconvenient truth, and the IPCC fourth assessment was released during my first year at Brown University. Both texts were required reading as part of an environmental change seminar I was in. And as Mona mentioned, since 2011, since graduation, I've been managing community relations and public affairs for large-scale onshore and offshore wind projects at several industry leaders. And I'm currently a manager at Avangrid, where I'm working on all of our offshore wind projects from New England through the mid-Atlantic and then into future regions. But looking into the future, I hope to continue my career in renewable energy through retirement, which will occur roughly around the same time that the New England states aspire to become net zero and fully powered by clean energy. So I guess by the time I'm retired, I will be chasing the sun and wind in entirely different ways. And so by reference, also, you'll hear a few terms from me tonight. The first is gigawatt, or GW. You'll see that. That represents about 1,000 megawatts. 1 gigawatt's about roughly enough to power 400,000 homes. Another term you'll hear from me a lot is capacity. That refers to the total amount of electric generation that's available for consumption through the grid at any given time. And so by way of background too, Avangrid is a first mover in offshore wind and the third largest renewable operator in the United States. The parent company, Iberdrola, is one of the largest electricity companies in the world. I'd like now to turn to the current and future status of wind power in the US. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about the status of onshore wind and how the US is positioned. Today, nearly 40% of the electric load in Great Plains states is powered by wind. The US has built 144 gigawatts of total installed capacity of wind, having started at about 2 gigawatts in 1999. And all of that is concentrated in states from Texas up to the Dakotas. It's called the Wind Belt. The state of Texas, where I've lived and worked on several projects, is actually third in the world in terms of installed capacity. And as you can see by the chart, by contrast, the states along the coast in the Northeast have the lowest shares of wind and solar power as part of their electric portfolios. So enter offshore wind. Coastal states do have access to large ocean areas with high consistent offshore wind speeds located relatively closely to large population areas. Since the U.S. Bureau of Ocean Energy Management first issued offshore wind leases over a decade ago, planning and development is now proceeding along all coasts, the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Gulf of Mexico, and the southern New England areas, though, and the mid and central Atlantic areas are the most furthest along in terms of their development in the pipeline. In 2024, this year, the federal government plans to issue new lease areas off Oregon, the central Atlantic, and in the Gulf of Maine. Now, coastal states have set some ambitious offshore wind targets as the leading driver of their plans for clean energy and decarbonization. The northeastern states collectively need a massive infusion of reliable, emissions-free generating capacity to both meet planned demand, new demand, as well as to replace existing or retiring units. Recent years, as Mona mentioned at the beginning, have seen market turbulence from the effects of COVID and inflation and then supply chain disruptions. And some companies have retracted from the market. Others, like mine, press on ahead. And for this reason, among others, 2024 is really something of a historic turning point in the evolution of the industry. Because the United States goal of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind energy capacity installed by 2030 would about match China's and Europe's current installed capacity. The way that goal was developed is, you can see on the left, They basically looked at all the projects that are in some form of development today or under construction or whatnot, and just simply added them up so as to say that everything that's being done today would materialize by the end of the decade in order to reach this goal. In practical terms, though, the United States has 172 megawatts of operating projects, and then another 3.4 gigawatts under construction. And among states, New Jersey and New York represent the largest pipeline of projects. They're also the most populous areas of the United States, and they represent two different electrical regions, which give some additional market benefits to those projects. Now, looking at Massachusetts, to meet the Massachusetts net zero by 2050 goal, Massachusetts needs to install 1 gigawatt of offshore wind power every year, starting in 2030. So what gets in the way of progress? If a large number of people want more renewables, where does the backlash come from? There's no question that utility scale renewable energy projects, and I've worked on many, create change in communities, and people are often weary and suspect of change. Ever since opposition to the earliest wind farms in California in the 1980s developed, researchers have tried to understand the sociological dynamics behind wind energy acceptance. And the practice of gaining social license to operate is a term that was first coined in the mining trade and then passed on into oil and gas, and it's now migrated over into renewable energy as well. And it's a term that's used to measure how companies gain acceptance in terms of legitimacy, credibility, and trust. And it involves many of the relationships that we're building here tonight, as well as some of the other communication methods, information awareness campaigns to promote understanding and really a drive to action. Now, many of the primary concerns of offshore wind that we hear about today align pretty well with the themes that have been found over the course of 30 years of wind energy acceptance literature. First and foremost, socioeconomics. The question of what's in it for me is the overwhelming driver of all forms of renewable energy projects in all communities. The second, perceptions generally about sound or health risks generally escalate up to the top. Third, visual concerns. Fourth, environmental concerns, including what sometimes biologists call charismatic megafauna, certain bird and mammal species like whales attract an outsized amount of attention for various reasons. Fifth, perceptions of fairness in the process. And then sixth, the actual distance from the turbines, which has been measured in measuring attitudes and responses throughout a number of projects on land and has yet to be done offshore, but is also a consistent variable. There are also organized funded programs that stoke fears. The Brown University Climate and Development Lab has reported how often grassroots appearing projects and experienced think tanks with ties to the fossil fuel interests have shared legal or financial tactical support to shape public perception. These types of well-funded misinformation campaigns have been part of onshore wind energy development for decades, and they're now spreading into the offshore arena. And these same types of dark money connections really honed their skills starting in the late 1960s through the 1980s in campaigns around tobacco and anti-smoking, and then gravitated towards the ozone layer in global warming in the 1980s and are now involved in wind development. These are some of the inconvenient truths that Al Gore spoke about nearly 2 decades ago. These opposition groups then often spread fallacies about impacts to wildlife, property values, health, and more. Now, the extent to which companies can manage and mitigate risks and impacts affects their ability to earn social license to operate. Another finding from social science research is that the perceptions of fairness ranked on the previous slide during the planning and permitting processes often has a most outsized influence on whether a project gets ultimately accepted in a host community. Now, recognizing that one of the key challenges, in addition or part of gaining acceptance, is the need to build up scale in establishing markets. The New England states have jointly issued this solicitation for up to 6 gigawatts of new offshore wind power. And now proposals were submitted on March 27th. This is the actual schedule that's printed in the RFP. And so, as you can see, awards aren't really expected until the late summer. It's an interesting, and we'll have to see what happens to the timeline of the review given the extension that was granted at the front end of the process, and see how that proceeds. But nonetheless, an evaluation committee of state agencies will review the proposals and make the decisions. Avangrid has submitted proposals in each of the states that have put out a proposal. So I'd now like to turn and talk a little bit more about Avangrid's New England wind projects. Excuse me. Avangrid is the developer of the first large-scale offshore wind project in the United States, Vineyard Wind 1. And while that's a tremendous accomplishment that's underway now, Avangrid's also seeking up to 2 gigawatts of additional capacity in the remaining portions of the lease area through what we're calling the New England Wind 1 and 2 projects, which are really among the most mature offshore wind opportunities in the nation, the furthest along the permitting processes, with the ability to achieve commercial operations before the end of the decade. And remember how I mentioned that at the beginning in talking about the various targets. One of the things about that's important about our projects is they're mostly shovel ready and could be implemented by that 2030 deadline, enabling the region to address these urgent climate and economic needs. Now, Avangrid's projects have the opportunity to deliver up to enough energy, to power up to 1 million homes and businesses in the region. This will end up reducing carbon emissions by up to 4 million tons of carbon dioxide, equivalent to removing over 700,000 cars from the road annually. The climate benefits are real, but the projects will also bring thousands of jobs to the region. And combined, the projects will support over 9,000 full-time equivalent jobs, making an $8 billion direct investment in the region. Now, looking down into what an offshore wind project actually amounts to, it has operational footprints at sea and on land. The wind energy generated by spinning turbines is gathered at an offshore wind substation. Here, the energy is stepped up to a higher voltage so that it's ready to be sent ashore via high voltage cables. Once it gets to the land, it reaches another onshore substation, which adjusts the voltage so that the electricity can be fed into the existing grid and then distributed via power lines to homes and businesses. Now, wind farms, like power plants, are modeled to operate on about a 30 to 40 year lifespan. The projects do and often do last longer. All of our projects are at the development stage, but they have nearly all of our state, local, and federal permits in hand. All of the grid interconnection rights have been secured. Project labor agreements have been signed with skilled local unions. So Avangrid is really ready to go. But to get to the next stage, an offtake or power purchase agreement is needed. We hope that this will be part of the award that comes through the New England wind solicitations. And with the offtake agreements in hand, Avangrid can then line up the financing and all the other logistical elements to get started on construction. An offshore wind project consists of 7 major scopes, 5 that are offshore, 2 that are onshore. Of the 7 packages, the wind turbine generators and the foundations represent the 2 largest areas of the project spending overall. for any given project, those two packages alone might comprise over 50% of the total spending. Now, the turbine manufacturers, there are only three, General Electric, Vestas, and Siemens Gamesa, are reporting that their margins are improving as they're recovering from the COVID backlog, though that there'll be continued material cost and some supply chain constraints as the manufacturing, which is all based largely in Northern Europe, recovers from that extensive backlog. And one of the things that's interesting, given that I've worked in the industry over time, I've seen the evolution of wind turbine heights. And although improvements in wind turbine design is called upscaling, are one of the primary factors that has reduced wind energy costs to date, there's increasing debate now about this continuation of an upscaling trend versus remaining at this 15 to 20 megawatt scale. Because each increase in capacity requires another additional large investment in supporting the infrastructure to handle the installation and the maintenance of each new turbine at each new scale. So that requires upgrades to factories, that requires upgrades to ports, that requires upgrades to the transportation between the port and the site, and then new and upgraded vessels. So as a result, there's often or potentially less energy that could be gained by increasing the turbine tower heights any further before the costs become greater due to the heavier components and the higher lift requirements. So that's an interesting trend to be observed. It's really sort of unknown now, but it's an area of debate. This is an example of the supply contracts for the Vineyard Wind project. One of the key ways that can help bring down the transaction costs and move construction at a faster pace is to build economies of scale through the supply chain. There's currently limited manufacturing capacity in the US, so the domestic supply chains can't meet the demand for the components for the projects, at least really through the end of the decade. Project developers have to make up this shortage by really importing most of the components, as I mentioned earlier, from Europe, where there primarily is the largest market for this industry. Investing in new marshaling ports and vessels is challenging because of the uncertainty in the project pipeline, as well as the high capital costs. The United States has a limited number of shipyards and ports that could handle the needs of the industry and a shortage of mariners. And now this risk can diminish over time as more US vessels are built and more US crews are trained. Avangrid is uniquely positioned as the developer of Vineyard Wind 1 and now the a developer of projects that are really shovel ready to deliver transformational projects to New England that can help meet our energy needs and economic opportunities. One of the areas, of course, is helping to expand New Bedford's position as an offshore wind hub. In New Bedford, Avangrid is partnering with a global equipment manufacturer, Liftra, on developing a first-in-the-nation davit crane manufacturing site at the Southcoast Mills, which is adjacent to the New Bedford Marine Commerce Terminal. And a davit crane is a special type of crane that's not currently manufactured in the United States that's used to lift equipment as the workers install and maintain the turbines. So it's a very unique and specialized opportunity to get to install first in the nation. And also we will be expanding the South Coast offshore wind hub economy by utilizing a newly constructed terminal that's operated by Foss Marine to be a construction logistics hub where all the crew transfers will take place using purpose-built special operations and crew transfer vessels that themselves will be locally built in part. Avangrid's projects will also spur the redevelopment of two former coal-fired power plants into new hubs in the clean energy transition space. In Salem, Avangrid's partnered into a binding lease with Crowley to serve as the anchor tenant for the development and construction of a new marshaling port in Salem. Our investment there will enable this project to proceed, and we'll be utilizing that for the New England Wind 1 and 2 projects as the principal destination where the wind turbines and related equipment will be stored and brought ashore before it's transferred to the lease area itself. And then in Somerset, working with the Prasimian Group which is developing a manufacturing facility at the Brayton Point site, we will hopefully receive the first subsea export cables that are developed at this factory for our projects when the factory itself is developed, and hopefully if the full bid that we've proposed is accepted. So thank you again for listening tonight. We do believe that the New England Wind Project is the right project at the right time, at this right historic transition period to help the region address its pressing energy and climate challenges, build out the American offshore wind supply chain, and bring communities along as we advance into a new energy transition. And for more information about Avangrid's projects, please check our website. It's easy to remember and shown here on your screen. With that, be happy to take any questions.
Well, Chris, thank you. This is a lot of it's a lot of information, and I think one thing it sort of makes me aware of is just how complex this industry is, and given all the other additional aspects of its complexity, including the fact that we don't have much of an offshore industry in the U.S. Now, you mentioned, I guess it was, this is actually my question, which is, what would you be, what are we thinking about in terms of actual development of offshore wind here in the United States? I know the turbines are coming from France, I think, and you mentioned that there's this project, what was it, the David crane, I guess. That's I didn't even think about some of these exotic pieces of equipment, so that's now expanded more of, wow. And I know that Europe is so much more ahead. I didn't realize to what extent China was as well. So I guess my question boils down to, what does the US have to do in order to become more self-sustaining in terms of just the basic materials and structures we need to be able to use to develop our industry?
Sure. To be honest, I'm not or even Avangrid is not the real entity that can address the question, because it's really properly framed by what's called the original equipment manufacturers, OEMs, the companies that actually make the decisions on how they choose to invest in a specific region. But I brought this slide back because it's ultimately the answer to the question, and that is the fundamental questions behind these types of infrastructure investment decisions is there a sufficient amount of a pipeline that can leverage the investments and make them a long-term success? And so, can the United States demonstrate that it is able to permit, and also does it have the grid interconnection in place to reliably interconnect the energy into the grid? Are sort of almost existential sort of style questions that are sort of being debated and shaped every day. So it's not what enables the original equipment manufacturers to locate a new facility in a new region or a new market is the demonstration of the potential for scale, and the potential for an active and ready pipeline. They will not invest the untold sums of money it takes to build a new facility, to train new workers, to license and to continue to permit for just simply one project, because it just simply doesn't make any economic sense at all. And so the sort of question that was posed during the growth of the onshore wind market, which was subject to fluctuating ups and downs based on the availability of what was known as the production tax credit. This production tax credit was authorized by the federal government in 1992. So the same year I graduated from high school, the same year that the President Bush signed the UN framework on climate change. That tax credit was really critical in getting the onshore market developed, because it provided certainty to the market that there would be effectively ability to pay off the projects over the long term. As I mentioned, these projects require huge amounts of capital up front, all up front, and do not generate revenue until they're constructed. So, think of that in terms of, how you apply to get car loans and bank mortgages for your homes and things. It's a very complicated situation as far as the capital goes. But ultimately, it has worked in the United States. And I mentioned Texas as an example. Texas reached 3.5 gigawatt of installed capacity, which is effectively where the United States could be in offshore if you consider the projects that are installed and operating, as well as those that are in construction now, back in 2006. And you can see its growth today. And so what made Texas successful was that you had public leadership in the form of various governors, starting with George W. Bush and all of his successors, in promoting Texas as a wind energy hub and taking available of all of the opportunities that are really present in our situation. And so it comes down to, public leadership matched by private capital, and a real strong constituency behind the need for new energy that's reliable, and emissions free. And also importantly, and this is true onshore, excuse me, and it's true offshore, is affordable. And part of the growth of onshore was due to the advancements in the wind energy efficiencies technologically that enabled the industry to grow as fast as it has. And so that's also an area, that's going to be important to watch as this new industry scales up as well.
Well, it's interesting because there's a question in the chat that says, how many of the jobs mentioned will persist after construction? And I think that points to some of the incentives and some of the ways you mentioned earlier, how public perception gets kind of affected. So, yeah.
So I was going to say, the job profile for an offshore wind project is very similar to that of any major infrastructure project. And if you think back into school as far as graphs, it has a sort of a bell curve shape. It really starts out, and this is true as far as investment and true in terms of jobs created. There's a concentrated amount of jobs that are created during a short amount of period of time for the installation or construction of the projects. But there's a longer amount, but a lower amount each year, but a longer amount in terms of total jobs during the operations period because of its longevity as far as time. And so when people ask about jobs, we say about 9,000 jobs, but that's really split over the different development phases. And it also involves the direct and indirect suppliers as well. So it's, but to answer your question effectively, there's a smaller amount of jobs developed during the development phase with an increasing amount during construction, and then it levels off, plateaus. It will start to decline during operations, but then will extend, as I mentioned, for about 30 years. So the operation management jobs, O&M jobs that are located in and New Bedford, for example, are really the long-term jobs that will be the long-term presence of the companies in the region, whereas the construction jobs will be by nature temporary.
Mm. Yeah, I know that in New Bedford in particular, the idea of it being a kind of opportunity for long-term skilled labor is a big sell here.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah, and Mayor Mitchell is he wrote some eloquent words on that very subject. There's another question in here. How can we monitor the performance of the turbines? And how often will they run and how much energy are they producing? This is a little further explanation. We all know that this area is prone to huge storms. What is
Mhm.
the plan for intense weather events such as wind speeds over 100 miles per hour and huge waves at sea?
Sure. Well, these projects are all regulated by a number of federal agencies uh, over a multi-year evaluation process. And so a number of these questions have been answered in the form of technical reports that have been submitted as part of what's known as the Construction and Operations Plan, or COP. That's the acronym. You can find the COP for every single offshore wind project, including Avangrid's projects, online at the U.S. Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM. They are the sort of information source where you can find all of those plans and the detailed subplans that respond to things like emergency response, for which we have a very detailed incident systems kind of a response. So many of these questions, though, can't be addressed simply in the nature of the plans I'm describing, insofar as they're part of the evolving science and the part of the evolving adaptation that will be needed. So there's some evolving questions around some of the issues related to storm events that have not yet been seen. But the technology has been designed with the best available science to help it, and similarly, developers use the best tools we have and the best science that's available to us to shape our decisions and where the turbines are located in relation to others, in relation to other factors. But then ultimately, when it comes down to how we respond in critical situations, then that comes down to the training and a lot of the systems learning that can be leveraged with the fact that we work with one of the largest electricity companies in the world that owns and operates offshore wind projects in many stormy areas, such as the North Sea off Scotland, for example, or the UK, where we have a lot of learnings there. So, many of these issues are certainly impactful to us living here, but many of the conditions have been felt other places around the world and have been shaped as part of our decision making. But again, for more specific information, I would point you in the direction of U.S. Bureau of Ocean Management. I find that as a valuable resource in trying to figure out other projects and just sort of comparing them and just seeing what others are doing. It's a nice website where all that information is compiled, and that's a principle, the federal agency that leads, the review of these projects through a number of years, and that works very closely I should say closely requires developers to submit additional information in response to many numerous questions that come along during the way. And of course, they're the ones who organize all of the public comment periods for all the permits as well. So that's another reason to sort of focus in on BOEM as your information resource on that.
Well, that's an interesting point. That's one thing that is in favor of not actually being the first in the industry. We can learn a lot from what's happened elsewhere. So that's good to know that there's a good repository for that.
Oh yeah,
What happens to the old turbine blades? How are they maintained? And I'd add to that, I think that's a big issue in terms of how we're going to recycle this.
sure.
Not just the blades, but let's say the rare earth metals in the magnets and in the turbines. I mean, that's a huge issue here.
Absolutely is. It is. And I've thought about this question myself in preparation, but also in reflecting on when I worked in the onshore market, where it's also prevalent and has been for a number of years. And what's interesting to see is that over time, um, first off, there's the chemistry, I guess you would call it, involved in the production of the materials for the blades themselves is advancing to the degree that they can be more they can break down more easily than in the past, as far as their ability to be um, processed, I guess, chemically. I'm mangling words because I'm not an expert in this, but effectively they're more sustainable in terms of their what's being applied into the blades themselves, which is basically a lot of fiberglass coating on top of balsa wood, often inside the core. And so in the onshore market, unfortunately, if you look at the early wind farms going back decades, those wind blades, when they were reached their end, they were cut into pieces and then landfilled for the most part, or exported as scrap metal if the market could be found. And that points to the challenge that's always been found in terms of this question. It relates to the other question, which is the need for scale and the need for a market. Because the companies that, and there have been several on the onshore, but now with the growing need and the growing volume that's being produced as far as blades and the need for the challenge, the original equipment manufacturers are starting to step in and take more of a responsibility as far as the life cycle of the supply chain for their products now. But it's usually been entrepreneurial outfits trying to find a niche into a new market with recycled content from blades, and it's just been hard to scale up. It's been under work, as I mentioned, and onshore for a number of years, but it's starting to gain more traction, I think, and hopefully it needs to. That's the way these types of solutions can really be worked out, as far as finding a new market where these products can be repurposed or somehow dealt with, because right now it's just the classic sort of sunk cost that gets displaced onto everyone.
So this is also an interesting question. At the end of the useful life of the turbine, will Avangrid be the company that deals with that end of life situation for the turbines?
Yeah, so the every project is required to have what's called a decommissioning plan, and that's submitted as part of the permitting review process. So ultimately, at the end of the useful life, the project would follow its decommissioning plan. Avangrid may, most likely be the long-term operator, but that portends to be seen over the long term. This decommissioning of offshore facilities in the oil and gas market has occurred for almost 100 years now. And so it's following kind of a similar set of processes that require that, put certain responsibilities on the part of the companies, in terms of its requirement to dispose of the sort of part of the infrastructure that is sort of below the water, or rather above the water, leaving the basic foundations in place. And over time, at least in the oil and gas market, those have been shown to continue to be sort of reef-like structures. But yes, we to answer your question, we would be responsible, or the company that's operating the project is, if we have a successor of some sort, would be responsible for the decommissioning of the facilities according to the plan that's regulated by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management.
This might sound like a really stupid question, but do all the coal plants and natural gas or fossil fuel gas companies have the same requirement to have a decommissioning plan at the end of the?
Yeah, of some sort. Most, and if they are licensed if they're a nuclear facility or hydroelectric facility and they get what's called a license to operate for a certain amount of times, then they go through a relicensing process, which is subject to a certain amount of time. And then if they choose to decommission, yeah, they would go. So that's a process that, is definitely part of the law. And I think that's a reflection of, the success of the modern environmental movement in terms of getting certain bedrock concepts, National Environmental Policy Act, for example, being the linchpin for, most of what we're talking about here as far as permitting goes.
Right. Switching gears a little bit, I read here that recent news reports have stated that U.S. electric demand is now growing 10 to 20% per year, primarily due to data center growth. I mean, we hear this all the time in Massachusetts that we've got to have more natural gas here because even if renewables can handle some of the steady state, but the additional, so we're in for the long run. Is there, I guess the question really is while fossil fuel companies, or especially fossil gas companies, are saying we're really requiring them because solar and the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow and all that, there'll never be enough to handle the marginal increase. So that's why we have to keep going. But what is your kind of reaction to that? And also sort of a corollary to that, to me, the whole answer here is storage of solar and wind energy. And to what extent is that something that can be used reasonably to mitigate or at least push back against some of these concepts that we're going to really need fossil gas to handle the increase of due to data centers or whatever?
Sure. That was a great question. I don't have all the answers because there's a lot involved in that question. But I would certainly say that to push back or to address the question, it's hard sometimes to separate myth from fact or truth from reality, because there are certain elements what are spoken that are factual, but often the points are either exaggerated or distorted. And I think that gets to often what we talk about, or what I referred to earlier about in the studies. And again, I refer to the Brown University Climate Development Lab studies that have focused in a little bit on what they call the discourse of climate delay. And this is also another thing that's been studied by sociologists for a number of terms. How cognitive processes frame how we view problems and how we ask questions. And often, I think it's sort of our mental processes that often shape this, because while it's true, wind and solar are intermittent, it's also true that we also live near, an area that has an abundant capacity for wind, and with increased penetration, we can find over time that the transmission grid itself has more capabilities than we may have earlier modeled. Many of the studies that are done initially are conservative. And so oftentimes some of the constraints that are perceived to be there lessen over time as more focus, as attention is paid to it. But I wouldn't also discount, the need for storage or some form of a backup, if you will, to hedge against the intermittency, which again can be addressed through technology, can be addressed through siting, in terms of that's kind of what the leasing process is all about. It's locating it in the windiest places, the most consistent places that are closest to shore, so that you can smooth out some of that intermittency that you would find higher if it was obviously a less windy place. But at the same time, there does need to be a backup. Historically, natural gas has played a key role in enabling the growth of onshore wind. That's how the Beyond Coal movement, was sort of founded back some odd 20 years ago, was to pair natural gas and wind to move towards a cleaner grid. And I think the word I use is cleaner. It's a continuing evolution, but it's one that they talk about the time periods earlier, and the fact that frankly I'll be retired in 2050. That speaks to me to the need to really get going faster, and that not to to allow for the continued science and technology that's being applied now to continue to take shape, is to not allow hesitation to get in the way of making needful progress with the tools that we have today that can be put in the ground today and start operating. Europe obviously went through these same questions when they started with offshore wind and have adapted. That's the nature of, I've found in relation to how humans and animals respond. As we evolve, we adapt, and we think of new ways to solve the problems. And so other areas of the world experience the same similar problems different ways, because they reflect the local conditions, but there are many lessons that can be learned. We're not exactly starting this fresh. We're not exactly starting all of these questions in a vacuum.
Well said. I see that Tom Kirk has his hand raised. Tom, do you want to ask your question, but unmute yourself?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Hi. Thank you, Laura and Mona for tonight and your presentation, Christopher.
Thank you.
I turned the camera on, but it might make everything go kaflooey. So I have a couple of comments, and then I do have a question out of that. Interestingly enough, I am sitting literally 10 minutes. I'm at Craigville Beach.
Okay.
I am sitting within walking distance of both the Cape Wind / Vineyard Wind project and the Park City Wind projects, and have been involved with that via the town of Barnstable for years. My question to you, Christopher, is could you tell everybody, you've gone into you're looking at getting this other funding source that you just completed an application for, that you're going to find out this summer about funding for the project, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, and so can you tell everybody, though, how this is involved with the town of Barnstable dealing with the 1972 Clean Water Act, where they are now being forced to do sewering and deal with wastewater issues on the Cape? As you probably know, Chris, or I'm sure you must, Christopher, excuse me, the town is desperately hoping that this thing is that the new agreement that you're gonna get is gonna help everything and allow you guys to do what you need to do, and at the same time do paving of local streets and stuff after the project is over. I know that this is really complex, and a lot of people are not really going to understand what I'm talking about. But that's what I want everyone to understand, is that this is not just about alternative energy at this time. This is really involved with the Cape and the town of Barnstable being sewered and dealing with septic issues. So there you go. If you could address that, Christopher, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. No, it's a really great question. I mean, you can see the dilemma in sort of talking about projects like this, because it's really hard to focus in on what level, because the theme of it all is transition and redevelopment or repurposing. Because you're right, one of the key elements or key benefits of the projects is sort of felt in what are often we call the host community, the area, the town where the cables coming from the wind turbines make landfall. And it's always at a beach, because that's the nature of where you make landfall ashore. And for what we call New England One, or formerly known as the Park City Wind project, is fully permitted and has a host community agreement with Barnstable that would assist the town in meeting its obligations under the Clean Water Act.
They've suspended that host city agreement, Chris.
Well, they have suspended it, but it's how do
They're
I
waiting
say?
to see what happens with the new agreement
Correct.
that you're seeking. You know,
Yes,
I'm
yes.
not trying to be negative here at all.
Yeah, right. And so are we. I mean, I guess you
Yeah.
could say in the sense that the process here, the solicitation process is driven by the state agencies, and
Yeah.
you know, in order to proceed further with projects, we need to have the financial wherewithal, the offtake agreements to proceed. So that speaks to the criticality of decision as far as getting the bid award decision, because you know, we are effectively shovel ready for that project.
Well, I mean, the thing that's amazing about it is that the opposition to it from people in the local community is really divisive, as you know, and ongoing, and negative disinformation. It's like they're reading out of Exxon Mobil's fossil fuel book, you know, kind of thing, and they're worried about the aquifer, and they're the same guys that have been putting tons of fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides on their lawns for decades. And now all of a sudden, those guys are turning around and going, "Oh, this could really hurt the environment, and it'll hurt the right whales." Sorry, Mona, I see I know I got you going there. So
Well,
anyway,
Tom,
everybody knows I'll step out, Mona. I'm sorry, I will step out. Excuse me.
you're
Go ahead.
okay. You're okay. You raised some important issues. It's
Yeah.
complicated. It's just, you know, everything. You turn up a clod of dirt, and you see all sorts of things going on underneath the ground. So you raise good questions. I am cognizant of the time, however. We have a couple more minutes, and I just wanted to get to, I'm sorry, we might not be able to get to everything, but it does, I think there was a question as to, where the heck was this? Okay, regarding the debate on the growth of turbine size, what size does Avangrid anticipate the New England Wind 1 turbines will be?
Yes, I think we are projecting the 15 megawatt, and that's pretty much the standard size. So the 20 megawatt turbine had been announced to the market by General Electric just a few years back, the Haliade X, and that was then subject to some patent disputes involving Siemens Gamesa, and then COVID hit, and the supply chain disruption hit, the market changed. And so for that reason, we're looking at a turbine that, again, is measured. And that gets back into the point I was making about where does it upscale from there? Does it continue on this, you know, sort of amazing trajectory, or does it start to stabilize? You know, one of the important things that's different about turbines on land versus at sea, of course, is the level of the ocean. And so the distance between the bottom of the blade tip and the surface of the sea itself, you know, makes a critical decision as far as projects that are offshore, as far as how high the tower heights can continue to go up. As I mentioned earlier, getting all the lifting equipment involved and all the vessels to bring that additional equipment. So for a number of reasons, the market is slightly slowing back and getting back into a slightly turbine size around 15 megawatts.
Okay, good. I think this is a question that's sort of a universal one that I get. How long will it take the consumer to realize savings on their electric bill from
Yeah,
renewable wind?
it's a good question, and it's sort of hard to necessarily pinpoint directly in your own power bill, though. There are definitely studies, and those are required as part of our permitting and licensing, both through the state and through the electric facilities board. So when we earlier talked about getting permits for Park City Wind or New England Wind 1, that's already gone through the electric facility siting board. Those have already had the similar demonstration of benefit to ratepayers. And so the answer to your question is they start generating benefits pretty quickly. But you know, it's not necessarily a one-to-one correlation between the entry of our project and your bill, because of a number of factors affecting the generation portfolio and your electric provider, whether it's Eversource or National Grid or others. So, but the benefits that come about from offshore wind, and particularly in New England, because we're powered in the winter by various heating fuels. The promise of offshore wind to wean us off some of those really costly fuels that really cost, have seen spikes. Hopefully we can start to mitigate some of that, and that can help be reflected in customers' bills pretty quickly.
Well, probably on a more philosophical level, the benefits are immediate because we're generating power
Absolutely.
without emitting a lot of CO2 or methane.
As
Anyway,
I learned at Brown University, from the perspective of the atmosphere, it doesn't matter as long as you reduce.
are we frozen here?
I'm here.
Oh, you're back.
Sorry.
You're
Yeah,
back.
okay. Anyway, Christopher, let me thank you on behalf of Climate Reality Massachusetts Southcoast. This was wonderful.
Oh, pleasure.
Very informative. As Laura mentions, it's being recorded, so we will publicize this through our newsletter to all our people that read our newsletter so that they can get the benefit of this knowledge. So thank you so much. I'm sorry to those people we didn't get all the questions answered, but stay tuned. We'll be having some more on this in the future. So with that, thank you very much, everybody, and
Have a good
enjoy
night.
your evening. Thanks again, Christopher. Bye-bye.